Hello, and welcome to the fifth episode of our live stream series, Altitude. It's a look at the behind-the-scenes world of air traffic management. My name is Jonny White, and I am taking over from Adi Dolan, who's done a superb job with the last four episodes. My background is slightly different, but I've put a headset on here so I can be a little bit like Adi, who is an air traffic controller. Please get involved today and ask questions. We're going to look at the impact of COVID on airports, how they can recover as traffic hopefully begins to return in the coming months, and how air traffic management, the role air traffic management can play in that, both now and in the medium term, 5 to 10 years. So as a reminder, as ever, you can submit questions over the 30 minutes and we'll try to cover as many as we can at the end. I suppose I'm the head of product development for NATS, so I'm looking at how we can bring technology to bear to solve aviation problems. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. Actually, when I was about 16, I travelled from Northern Ireland to England for an interview. It was the first time on a plane, first time out of Northern Ireland, arrived at Heathrow, and I decided then that this was a place where I wanted to work, or a field that I wanted to work in. Aviation was glamorous, it was exciting, it was opening new possibilities, it was creating the ability to travel and to see new things. And I think we should always remember that that feeling from that age has stayed with me really strongly ever since. And we're in a survival position at the moment. It is grim, but what we do still enables those connections, and that's as I say, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. So to talk about the airport and ATC link, I've got Adrian Clark, who's our manager of our advanced concepts within NATS Airspace and Future Operations team. Aid, can you let me know what's your interest in this subject?
Hi, I started off my working life as an air traffic controller, and then some 16, 17 years later joined NATS in the R&D department. And I started working in the field of queue management, which is basically how to organise arrivals, how to organise departures in a way that makes sense for everybody. And by everybody, I mean the airport, the airline, and for the ANSP. And I did that for a number of years within CESAR and other types of R&D. Then I moved to NATS operational strategy so that some of those ideas had a chance then to take those ideas and put them into a plan of deployment. And then more recently, in the last few years, I've worked as manager at advanced concepts, which is again looking at some of the more technologically centered, cleverer ways, if you like, of doing this subject, as well as looking at broader subjects like how ATM and UTM can converge, working with Airbus on formation flights, those sort of things.
Excellent. Oh, thanks, Aid. I mean, and we've known each other for a long time. You're very much in the regulated business. I'm in the commercial business within NATS, and working together across that bridge, it's been very rewarding. Steve, you're one of our senior consultants, and you've worked with airports around the world. I've also known you for a long time. It's been a total pleasure. We've also travelled to some fascinating operations around the world. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Well, I joined NATS 15, 16 years ago, fresh-faced graduate into our analytics department, working on all sorts of exciting ways to help improve efficiency of our operation in all senses of the word. And I guess for the last 5, 6 years, I've been focused on how airports in particular can apply technologies and collaborative approaches with ATC and airports to improve efficiency and capacity.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, Steve, let me ask you the first question then, but Aid, feel free to come in. So, Johan Lundgren, who's the Chief Executive Officer of EasyJet, said that survival, recovery, growth will be the stages we're going through in the coming months, with the speed of those phases being dependent on vaccination. In your work with airports around the world, what are they telling you that are their biggest challenges as traffic begins to return?
Well, I guess for sure the first thing is short term. It is all about survival and finance, whether that's airports, ATC, or airlines. I think we're all as an industry in that really tough period where we've got to find financial ways to get through the situation. I think longer term, some are also now starting to think back to what those capacity growth initiatives might be. So, when the traffic is back at pre-COVID levels, what do they need to do to continue to improve and enhance capacity? And then there's this fuzzy period in the middle where there's not so much certainty about how traffic will recover. And I guess the critical thing is that traffic is likely to come back in quite a lumpy way. So in some respects, the peak hour capacity will continue to be quite strong. But actually, there'll be other periods of the day where it's very, very quiet still. And so that leads to quite difficult problems about how do we apply resources, how do we roster staff, how do we allocate our resources to actually make the most of the assets that we've got. So it's a tough challenge, but it's certainly now kicking into how do we encourage recovery, how do we encourage traffic back. And certainly fuel burn initiatives, making the airspace more efficient, making the airport turn processes more efficient. They're all critical right now.
I mean, some of the operations that we've looked at around the world, they sort of split it. Some are going down a digital journey, some are going down a ground-based infrastructure journey. I'm reminded that just before COVID, Michael O'Leary, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Ryanair, was saying to airports, don't come to me with money, asking for money for infrastructure projects if you haven't benchmarked your high intensity runway operation capacity against the best. Do you think we've seen the end of these big infrastructure projects?
Not at all, no. I mean, I think there are places around the world where investment in infrastructure continues. Look at India, for example, right now. There's much stronger recovery in traffic because of the strong domestic market. To an extent, that's also true in the US. We're starting to see investment coming in Australia from the government to try and kickstart the aviation industry back again. So I don't think it's the end of infrastructure projects. But there are a lot of places around the world where there's a real struggle on how to use the assets that are there, and where assets have been switched off. So either parts of terminals have been closed, or, for example, there are fewer staff available to do the same job. So there remains a real strong need to focus on how we can make the best use of what we've got. And I guess that's something that in the UK, we've been struggling with that problem for a long time anyway. So a lot of the things that we've been doing over the last 5-10 years, certainly maybe even longer, have been really focused on how to extract the absolute best out of the assets that we have right now. But then there's this balance of when's the right time to invest? What are the infrastructure development plans, and at what point do they really kind of kick in?
Yeah, no, understood. I mean, it's the idea of getting more from less and then more for less. So let's reduce the costs in investment. Let's make investment count.
We're always, we're always, as you know, we're regulated in 5-year investment cycles, and for as long as I've known it, then clearly we've always designed tools to support different stages of the economic cycle. Obviously, this is a much more serious version compared to a traditional recession, but the emphasis does tend to fluctuate between a focus on cost and a focus on capacity. So when times are hard, then the emphasis is clearly all about fuel saving and reducing costs where possible. But then you can guarantee that 2-3 years later, things will have changed and the focus will be about capacity. So when we look at tools to support the operation, we have to make our tools proof to those different parts of the cycle. We need to be able to switch the emphasis, and so generally speaking, that's what we do.
Excellent. What do you think airports can do in the short and medium term, and in that longer term world in which you inhabit, to get the best from what they have?
I guess I'm more interested in the interface between the ANSP and the airport and the airline. So it's not just an airport focused conversation. So one of the things that a lot of people are talking about now is obviously the environmental agenda, quite reasonably. And so so our interest now is in saying, when traffic recovers, do we want it to recover back to the kind of operation we had before? And obviously that's a balance, everything's a balance, but one of the facts is that certainly in some of our London airports, especially Heathrow, holding is traditionally higher than perhaps we'd want it from an environmental point of view. So part of that Build Back Better type agenda is on how we can, as traffic comes back, we don't end up with the level of holding that we used to. So therefore, how do we, we've got a variety of ideas and tools that are in the pipeline to help address that.
Do you find that that the operation is particularly unpredictable at the moment in the short and medium term?
See, yeah. To be honest, I don't work in an area which has to focus on the short term. We are in an area. I work in operations strategy. We are trying to come up with a set of tools that will see us for the next economic investment cycle, and then the one after that. And so our interest is in tools and procedures and concepts that will help support all of these things. It is not a short, clearly there is a short-term need, I obviously accept that, but we also have to handle the various other bits later on as well. So we have concepts like, well, we've worked with Heathrow quite closely on a Heathrow project called demand capacity balancing. Just to give an example of this stuff, demand capacity balancing allows you to control the level of airborne holding you have, and also manage your departures as well. And so you can change the levers if you like. You move the levers any way you want in order to do that. You can say we'll have lots of holding or we can have little holding, and there's a consequence on that. If you want to have less airborne holding, then that has to go somewhere. So that translates into either pre-departure delay, or in the case of long hauls, long haul slowdowns or speed adjustments. And what you're trying to do is, we've got a schedule. Obviously, we start off life with a schedule which says lots of aircraft get airborne, but they can't simultaneously depart on time and arrive on time, because, well, not the long hauls can't. It's the long hauls are obviously affected very much by the jet streams, the winds. An interesting fact is that the flight between New York and Heathrow, for example, that flight duration will vary by an hour depending on if the aircraft is sitting in or out of a really strong jet stream. So in an industry that is measured by depart on time, the idea that you can also simultaneously arrive on time is just not the case. Those aircraft from America might be scheduled to arrive at a time, but they're going to pitch up early or they're going to pitch up late. And depending on the daily variation in that, might coincide with aircraft arriving early or late from other destinations, from other departure points. So the net result of all of that lot is you end up with stack holding. So the demand capacity balancing story is one of trying to manage that those arrivals to reduce the level of airborne holding. Why? Because we're trying to reduce the level of fuel, and therefore cost. So there's the cost and the environmental benefits from that.
I guess what's interesting is those choices have always been there. Those choices were there pre-COVID. They're still there, whilst we're recovering. And the trick is, how do we find the right balance as traffic comes back? What is the, if you like, the graphic equalizer? Where do you set it for the operation as we recover? I think, given that fuel cost is a major component of the airline's costs in operating, anything that we can do to reduce airborne delay, reduce delay on the ground, increase stability and predictability in the operation, can help encourage airlines to come back faster and maybe be more open to operating routes that previously would be seen as a bit 50-50 whether they'd be profitable or not. If we can bring those routes back online whilst passenger levels are suppressed, that will help the industry recover, and it will help us demonstrate that the industry is doing all it can to be environmentally sustainable. And I think that's a really positive thing that we can do in out of the the carnage in the industry, if you like, of COVID, there's some real positive opportunities we can take from this.
Yeah, there's no doubt, I think, in my mind, that real efficiency can satisfy a resilience requirement. It can satisfy a predictable operations requirement. It can minimize the buffers, whether that be in schedule or in holding. And it can actually, so it can deliver fuel savings, capacity and resilience, or environmental benefits, and maybe all of those things. So we can create the good news story that aviation needs. I'm minded
just make a quick point there, Jonny. The ICAO and the European Commission and all parts of the aviation industry are all driving down a world of getting everybody involved to re-engineer their systems to essentially produce data. You know, it's like the aviation industry's course onto the existence of the internet. Cool. But you know, right now we can't publish all of our data to lots of other people. It all lives in our little world, and that's the same for all parts of the industry. And yet we need to move, and are in fact being encouraged down a path to start sharing data. Okay, data, big deal. It's not that exciting, but if you start making use of that data, then you can start to draw together all these different threads. Listen, you know, I'm one of many people who would love a vision of aircraft springing into the skies from around the globe so as to magically pitch up at the destination airport, all neatly lined up, one after the other with zero holding. Wouldn't that be brilliant? But equally,
why can't we have that?
Yes.
From an idealist position, and I hate queuing. That's another thing. I love airports, and I got a magic experience in Heathrow when I was 16. I also hate queuing, so that's probably two reasons why we're having this conversation.
Well, if you take the destination airport focus, clearly you could do that, but you could just as easily tell the story from the departure airport point of view, where they're busy trying to arrange for aircraft to get off their stands at the relevant time, because that stand's needed for another aircraft. You could tell that story from the airline point of view, where they're trying their very best to make sure that connecting passengers connect. And so the task really is to come up with the balance that that best meets the airport need, both ends, the airline needs, and the ANSP's job is to help facilitate that. And so the only way we can get there is by better data sharing, and that's mainly to do with the aircraft trajectory. In the future, we'll start talking about drone trajectories and remotely piloted aircraft trajectories and all the rest of it. It's a story of the trajectory of a moving flying thing, and how best to balance out all of the various needs in place. And we can do that, and we'll do that as starting off as a human process, which is what we do. But increasingly, you can teach a machine, you can give a machine a set of rules to try and take the various factors into account.
I think it's interesting. We as ATC, we often think about trajectories as the key thing that we need to manage and handle, and of course we do in the tactical environment. But I think for a lot of resource planning, for a lot of the way in which we organise ourselves, we're also really interested in the time when things are happening. So the more predictability, the more stability that we can generate in when an aircraft is going to be at a particular point in time, whether that's an airspace sector, whether that's on the ground at an airport, or even it's somewhere else en route to our airport. The topic here around how do we support airport recovery, how do we build back better, how do we grow back stronger, I think for me is one which is all about introducing more and more predictability and stability so that we all know what's happening. And it's probably a bit of an ask that everything's going to magically jump into the sky and come in on rails, and we don't need to intervene with those aircraft at all. But that flow of moving from people and resource based operation to tool and automation based operation, and finding that middle ground where there are tools that now can support our people and our resources to do more, I think that's where we'll find this sweet spot, where it's not about creating some artificial intelligence, robot ATCO, but perhaps more about how do we give individuals more and more certainty about when aircraft are going to want to do something. And that is about connectivity around the whole network. That's not just about, one flight or one ATCO. That's about sharing that information widely. So I think one of the most critical ways that we can help improve and help airports recover faster is about data sharing. We all have little bits of information about when we think aircraft are going to operate. We also have different views of the forecast schedule. So right now, I mean, a real drama, if you like, is from day to day, the number of aircraft that are operating, even at suppressed levels, is really quite volatile, and not in a way that we've had in the past. So the more that as an industry we can collaborate to share and get that data out there, I think that's a real key part of how we do build back better.
Sorry, jump in. An example that we often use for this subject is time-based separation, because we've talked about this quite a lot before. But as you know, the traditional way of doing separation between aircraft on final approach is that a human being, a controller, memorises a set of rules. We classify all the different aircraft types up into different groups depending on the size of aircraft and the amount of wake vortex they create. A human remembers a set of rules and makes sure that those aircraft are appropriately separated that way. But then as we try and make better and better use of our constraining factor, which is the runway, then we're looking for ever more ingenious ways of safely reducing that separation. And so now we're looking at a pairwise version of time-based separation, where you look at the individual amount of space required to account for the wake vortex between any particular pair of aircraft down to the specific aircraft type, and the amount of time they'll take to use the runway, either to land on it and get off it, or to account for departures, getting onto it and departing from it, and a few other factors. And a human just can't remember all of those factors, but clearly a machine is very good at doing this stuff. So it's a kind of very simple example of automation where the tool takes account of a load of different factors, it does some maths, and it displays something on a screen for a human to then deliver against, i.e. for a final approach director to stick an aircraft radar return on that indicator. And that is simple automation.
And we work closely with LIDOS around intelligent approach and to do that. And then one of the things, talking about automation, predictability. I know we've touched on it earlier in the conversation, but I still hear people within aviation talking about, it's a shame aircraft don't fly the schedule. If only they flew the schedule, everything would be fine. And I know we've touched on it before. I don't think I've ever had the chance to ask both of you, predictability and flying the schedule, given that aircraft don't fly the schedule because of all the disruption and that we've talked about, how can we, and we want to move towards automation in future. My simple brain says automation needs predictability to have the strongest opportunity to succeed. I mean, we talk about, actually, I haven't really made that link before to automation. We talk about reduce the number of red days in an operation because you've actually planned in advance and planned out the dramas before they happen, because you're more in control of that future view. How can we bring more predictability into that collaborative space between airport, air traffic control and airline?
I'll have a go first, if I may. Steve and I, as you know, were both involved with Heathrow on the Heathrow demand capacity balancing tool, and the principles we took there are that because essentially we have to account for, never mind all the factors to do with passengers, but we've just got to account for the variation in flight duration for long hauls. I mean, that's one of many factors. And so basically you predict what you can at the points where you can. So it's perfectly possible to take a weather forecast, look at some wind and say, right, okay, that's likely to affect tomorrow's flight. It is perfectly possible to look at the database, if you like, of departure accuracy and say, traditionally, this flight from this particular airport usually leaves within about 15 minutes of its scheduled time, or 20 minutes, or whatever it happens to be. It's just a set of data. And then in advance, you work out what's likely to happen, not what definitely will happen, but what's likely to happen. And in effect, that becomes your new schedule for the day. So there is a published schedule, which is what passenger tickets look like, but then you replace it with, from an industry point of view, replace it with what's most likely to happen. And then chances are, then you're going to get something that looks quite a lot like that. And that's when you start getting into the whole airport operations plan concept, where the having run that prediction of what's likely to happen, the airport can then start marshalling its resources around that. You know, it can start planning its fuel operations and its catering and all the rest of it. It can look at the passenger flows, and clearly the airport is investing in passenger flow modeling software. and looking at how it can deploy the border force to meet the likely predictability of the passenger flow and all the rest of it. So all of this stuff needs a dynamic schedule, if you like, upon which to operate. And then that dynamic schedule keeps updating and updating. So you have this ever refining process, which is, I mean, it started off as the airport collaborative decision-making process and has since evolved into what I'm talking about now. I could go on, but let's let Steve have a chance.
Steve?
Well, I mean, I'm just building on what Aid said there. I mean, I think there's also the automation in how we deal with, hard circumstances. So when we would ordinarily need to regulate when traffic is delayed, how do we do that more effectively? And we had the benefit and the opportunity through Cesar to do some trials of automating a cherry picking methodology around regulating. So ordinarily traffic is regulated and everybody gets a fair share of that. They're held on the ground, at least in the European context. And instead, during the trial, we applied what we call target time of arrival. So we had this opportunity to select which aircraft would arrive in which sequence.
Yes.
And that meant that we were able to continue putting the maximum pressure, if you like, on the runway. And when you have pressure on the runway, you get to optimize the runway sequence. So with the target time of arrival concept, overall, we were able to show somewhere between 25 to 40% reduction in the overall level of ATFM delay required to keep the operation safe and to keep airborne holding in a reasonable level.
Yeah.
As we go forward out of COVID, one of the opportunities that we have is to set a different level of airborne holding that we could have. So instead of having, say, an average of maybe 8 to 10 minutes of delay inbound to Heathrow, what if we set that target to be more like 5? So yes, there would be the consequence of perhaps some more delay on the ground, but we would have less airborne holding and therefore less fuel use. So that would be more environmentally beneficial, and it would also cut costs. So there's some trade-offs to be had. It's not necessarily a straightforward decision. It's not necessarily an operational decision, but these are the choices that we have now that we have automated that target time process. So I see that as a really key part of how we can apply something tangible into the operation almost now.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this in almost academic terms here, but I do remember talking to a pilot from Singapore, and he was just describing what it was like having just done a 12-hour flight from Heathrow back to Singapore. Finally pitches up on home airspace, and the first thing that happens is turn right 90 degrees, head out to sea, and that's somewhat dispiriting after a big long flight. So if we can, the concept of a target time of arrival where you massage your speed over a big long flight so as to arrive and not get turned right 90 degrees and head out to sea is attractive to everybody.
I mean, I agree, and I'm thinking. I mean, you brought up the drive from Cesar in this. You brought up, we have partners like Harris Orthogon who've helped bring some of this technology to life. Heathrow have been a leader in this space, and we're in a partnership with Heathrow, co-developing this capability to try and advance aviation, which is one of the key things that NATS wants to do. We are about advancing aviation. Your Singapore example, I don't know whether you're being very clever, Aid, but we've had a question from on behalf of Changi Airport in Singapore. So it says airports are already adopting ACDM and RMS to optimize operations. What's the next step?
Maybe I'll go first. So I think what we've described today is a little bit around a kind of ACDM plus. It's the next step really in terms of the data blocks and the collaboration platform. So if you imagine ACDM has, I think it's 15 milestone events through a flight, and really they've been focused on optimizing the departure process at airports. So it's about getting the information there that allows the turn time to be reduced, and then stability into the network. The demand capacity balancing process and the target time of arrival steps they, if you like, put the arrival process on top of ACDM. So it gives better predictability and stability for the arrivals that then allows the departures to be better planned and more stable. And as a result, there is a fortuitous circle of improvement. Yeah. So I would say that ACDM and resource management systems within CDM processes are here to stay. I think they're the bedrock of how we improve and how we deliver stability and optimization in airports. But we also need to add in those ATC processes about how we can tangibly improve the arrivals. And I see demand capacity balancing processes as that key step.
For me, I would love to see a join up between airports. So I'm a big fan of the ICAO FFICE concept, it's called, which basically is about sharing data between everybody. So at Heathrow, as we mentioned, we talk about the creation of this target time of arrival, but really, I think it'd be fantastic to have that back calculated into a departure time. In Southeast Asia, for example, they have this multinodal thing, which is in essence a means of linking a departure and arrival airport. That TTA could turn into a departure time specific for the winds on the day. So instead of having a fixed departure time, if you could have a slightly more flexible departure time to account for that flight duration, and then have this, you could then set up a communications network. You'd start off with the main hubs of the world and just start spreading out from there, really. So in my mind, it would be a dynamic scheduling process to replace the current seasonal static scheduling we have.
It's funny, I was minded on one of the Eurocontrol straight talk sessions, the CEO of KLM saying that hub and spoke might be the way ahead for certainly in the short and medium term. Point-to-point flights will take a bit of time as business travel returns. Maybe if we're going into a stage of slightly reduced traffic, hopefully as little reduction as possible, but and that hub and spoke operation, that's exactly the time to be doing what you're suggesting. I hadn't thought of that. I have another question here, if I may. Stephen from Eurocontrol has asked, what is the single biggest impact change that airports can do to improve punctuality, predictability, and therefore the best environmental benefit in and for the network? Okay, so we've got airports, we've got punctuality, predictability, and then a network link. A lot of what we talked about so far today has been just actually touching on that link between the players in our aviation space, the network, the airline, the airport, the ANSP, collaborating to get the best possible performance out of the system. But for me, what's the single biggest thing we can do, Aid?
And I keep going down on the theme I've already gone for, which is that it's not about punctuality against the published schedule, because for all sorts of reasons that's hard to achieve. The aim of the game should be that the aircraft is in the sky for the least amount of time necessary to fly from A to B. In other words, we don't have unnecessary additional track miles. And in order to do that, then we do have to account for all the very many real world factors that are out there. And so I am quite a fan of the technology solution to this. It's basically a development of the ACDM principles. You say when your aircraft's ready to go, you have a system that can factor this stuff in, and therefore, and that data is shared with others. But I totally accept that to make that work, then really you need some flexibility on the ground. So to make that vision work, you need spare stands and holding areas. So it does come, nothing's for free. It comes at a price in terms of airport infrastructure.
Steve, any thoughts from you? What's the single biggest impact change that airports can do to improve punctuality, or are you just going to say what Aid said?
Well, I don't want to repeat what Aid said. I think for me it's about data sharing. I think that is really key. I think we've seen such a strength of improvement as ACDM has been adopted. I think, given the question is primarily in the context of Europe and European Network Manager, I think the more airports that come online with CDM, that helps deliver stability in departure predictions. And I think the more airports that come online with AOP, NOP integration over the coming years, I think that's going to be a real key factor in driving that stability, driving predictability, and allowing the network to make the best decisions as well, because I think we can often kind of look at a parochial level about what's happening right in front of us, but at a network level there is the opportunity to make, you know, choices that may seem locally less positive but actually globally have a much bigger impact. And I think that is a key part of how we go forward. I think it is worth, though, taking a little step back and saying it's not just about the tactical day-to-day sharing of data. It is also about saying, you know, we now have the capability to look at weather forecasts that are pretty good, you know, 10 days out. And actually that data sharing needn't start on the day or maybe day -1. That data sharing can start much earlier than that. I think the airports are best placed to take that view as to how they want to use their assets on a particular day.
Yeah, there's definitely something in that. Definitely something in airports representing their needs really clearly based on a technology and a really good plan, the airport operating plan, AOP, that you mentioned, and representing those needs effectively into the collaborative space of network, airline, and ANSP in a way that we don't make lots of changes to achieve a small benefit, but we make the right changes, the optimized changes to achieve an overall benefit. That collaborative space is again, I'm going back to that why I get excited about airports. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. We've got another question from Stephen at Fujitsu. In recovery, what is likely to be the most important way we can contribute to sustainability?
I guess by sustainability, then certainly in the next few years, you know, not going longer term into different fuel sources and all the rest of it, but for what's happening in the next few years now, the best thing we can do is to reduce the amount of fuel used by aircraft. And that means focusing on, well, certainly we in NATS have a big focus on stack holding. We need to get down the level of stack holding, really, because that's an obvious win. But there's all the other projects that are already firmly in the pipeline. There's free route airspace where aircraft can fly straight lines. That's at the European level. We talk about systemization quite a lot. So systemization is the idea that you define your airways in terms of a more tightly defined performance-based navigation route, essentially a railway line in the sky. And then we use that better data that we've been talking about the whole time and the trajectories of aircraft, so as to try and come up with a plan that's a bit earlier. So what we don't want are two aircraft flying side by side all the way down to the airport area, because only one can land at a time. So the second one then has to wait a little while. You know, you might as well have slowed the second one down to come in nice and smoothly. And so we're doing a piece of work on arrival streaming, which is part of the wider systemization bit. So systemization is the change of your airspace to define more precisely described routes for arrivals and departures, essentially railway lines in the sky. And then the complementary piece of work that goes with it is the arrival streaming bit, where we ask our neighbouring ANSPs to adjust aircraft speeds so that aircraft pitch up basically in a big long line prior to descent on these PBN routes. Because if we can do that, then the aircraft get to fly their most environmentally efficient descent profile. So really, it's all trying to work towards this idea that we restrict the level of stack holding to a manageable amount, and then we try and see what's left and try and stream aircraft into that stack, so they're all flying an environmentally efficient descent profile. And then, having got as far as the stack, we then try and use something like time-based separation to land aircraft as close as they safely can, so as to minimize the amount of time spent in the stack. So all of these things, we're talking about them in a slightly roundabout way, but essentially we've got a series of complementary layers which all add up to actions to try and reduce the environmental impact.
Maybe I can add a slightly less operational view, but I think it's also important that we have clear ways of measuring and tracking performance and setting globally agreed targets. I think, you know, I completely agree with everything Aid said in terms of what we can do operationally and how we can physically make the operation more sustainable. But I also think we need to have the right regulatory frameworks, we need to have the right metrics, we need to have the right incentives in place, and that they are shared goals by airports, air traffic and airlines. Yeah. I think it's really tough for, you know, any one of those parties to act on their own. Clearly, the airlines have fleet investment plans, and that will be driven by the cost of fuel. As an air traffic organisation, NATS has a regulatory framework that says we're incentivised to do certain things to improve sustainability, which I think is excellent. But I don't see a universal framework in which that's applied, either across Europe or globally. And I think it really has to be something that's at a global level. Yeah. I guess the direct answer to Stephen's question is, I think a global framework is really key.
It brings to mind something that came up for me this morning, which was the 3DI score that we use in the regulated ANSP, three-dimensional inefficiency. Did flights get the most efficient route out, and can we on a consistent way across aviation score inefficiency to say, look, these bits are really inefficient, let's improve them, and that's a bit that you can focus. Maybe the inefficiency is an interface between airport and ANSP, or between ANSPs. We can identify where that is and start driving out that inefficiency. Okay, this is a difficult question, I think, because our experience is every operation is different. Every operation is led by different people, often with different drivers and incentives. Beata at S&P Global has asked, what were the main challenges facing airports prior to COVID, and what needs to happen for traffic to reach pre-pandemic levels? So I think there's two questions. It's like the COVID briefings from number 10. There's always a second question, isn't there? So what were the main challenges facing airports prior to COVID? And then secondly, what needs to happen for traffic to reach pre-pandemic levels?
Well, there's a lot in that. That's a fairly big question. I guess the really noddy answer, if you like, to that is that every airport is unique because it has different sets of challenges, whether that's the geography of the airport, the traffic at the airport, whether that's the level of investment, all sorts of different things going on. And I think I've had the benefit of visiting lots of different airports around the world, and I can safely say that they do all have very, very different challenges. But probably the thing that unites everybody is the cost of the operation, and trying to do the absolute utmost to minimise costs and maximise revenue. And I think that challenge is there irrespective of COVID. I think the second part of the question was to do with how we can get traffic levels back to pre-pandemic levels. Again, a very big question, and I think that lots of people will have different opinions on. So I guess my personal opinion is there are two or three things in play. One is passenger confidence. I think it seems to me from everything that we're seeing that the leisure market is likely to come back more quickly. There's pent-up demand is the phrase that we hear frequently for people wanting to go on holiday because they haven't been able to for the last 12 months. But a big part of that is where people are confident to travel, and therefore where the airlines put routes on, and which airports are going to be winners and losers from that, if I put it that way. The flip side, of course, is we've got lots of human-based resources, whether it's pilots, whether it's air traffic controllers, engineers, whether it's baggage handlers, all sorts of different, very particular skills in the industry that we have to try and keep a hold of and try and organise
to maintain. Aid, I'm being told we're close on time.
That's fine.
I think so. Yeah, just to wrap up, passenger confidence, getting passengers into planes again. Going back to that statement at the start, the magic of travel, this thing that we provide for people and do a really good job on, really advanced, industry. Getting passengers confidence and putting the pleasure back into travel for them is really important. Predictability in our operations and links between the stakeholders, that seems to be what the theme is of our conversation. Listen, thank you all for watching. I hope you found it interesting. And that's the end of our 5th episode of Altitude. We're back next month where we'll be looking at whether aviation can ever be environmentally sustainable. So picking up some of the questions that have been asked. I hope you can join us then. If you have any feedback, you can email us at info@nats.co.uk or tweet us at @nats. And keep an eye on all the social media channels for details of episode 6. Steve, as ever, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.